No explosion, no rushing water, no screaming machinery, just silence spreading through the Atlantic like a held breath, and then, somewhere in the depths, a German submarine stopped running. The U-boat commander would have felt it first, a sudden wrongness in the pressure, in the engine hum, in the very water around his hull. His hydrophone operator might have heard something, or perhaps nothing at all. That was the point. While American destroyers dropped depth charges that announced their presence for miles, shaking the ocean with thunder that every submarine within 10 nautical miles could hear and evade, the British were perfecting something else entirely. Something that killed without warning, without sound, without giving the enemy time to dive deeper, to change course, to slip away into the dark. This is the story of the British Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon. The invisible killer that sank more U-boats per engagement than any depth charge ever would. And the question the Kriegsmarine never answered: how do you evade a weapon you cannot hear coming? 1941. The Atlantic was dying. Not the ocean itself, the lifeline. Britain's umbilical cord to survival stretched 3,000 miles across submarine-infested waters. Every merchant convoy that limped into Liverpool or Glasgow carried the fuel, the food, the ammunition that kept the island nation breathing. And every week German U-boats sent dozens of those ships to the bottom. The numbers told a story of methodical strangulation. In 1940, U-boats sank 471 ships too. 4 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1941, the figure climbed to 432 ships. In 1942, it would explode to 1,160 vessels destroyed. Over 6 million tons sent beneath the waves, tankers carrying aviation fuel, freighters loaded with grain, troop transports packed with soldiers who would drown in the frigid Atlantic, never reaching the war they'd been sent to fight. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. The Battle of Britain could be won in the skies over Kent. The Western Desert could be held with tanks and determination. But if the convoy routes failed, none of it mattered. Britain would starve into surrender without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. The Royal Navy's answer was the depth charge. A drum of high explosive, 300 to 600 pounds of Amatol or Torpex, set to detonate at a specific depth. Destroyers and corvettes would race over the suspected position of a submerged U-boat and roll these charges off their sterns, dropping them in patterns. Ash cans, the sailors called them. The explosions created massive underwater shockwaves capable of crushing a submarine's pressure hull like an eggshell, but they had to explode close, very close, within 20 feet for a kill. Within 50 feet to cause serious damage. And the ocean is vast and U-boats are small, and the Atlantic is cold enough that sonar layers bend and scatter, creating false echoes, hiding submarines in thermal pockets where sound waves refuse to penetrate. The real problem, though, was simpler than physics. Depth charges announced your attack before it began. The moment a destroyer began its attack run, increasing speed toward the U-boat's last known position, the submarine commander knew exactly what was coming. He could hear the escort's propellers accelerating through his hydrophones, that distinctive thrashing that meant death charges were seconds away. He had perhaps 30 to 40 seconds of warning, enough time to order emergency dive. Enough time to change course, enough time to go deep or shallow, left or right, anything to be somewhere else when those charges detonated behind the attacking ship. And here was the cruelty of depth charge geometry. The escorting destroyer had to pass directly over the target to drop its charges, had to race forward while the U-boat twisted away beneath. By the time those charges sank to detonation depth, 150 feet, 300 feet deeper, the submarine had moved. Sometimes only a few yards, sometimes far enough that the explosions did nothing but churn water and kill fish. Convoy escort commanders calculated that it took an average of 150 depth charges to sink a single U-boat. Some sources suggest the figure was closer to 200. Think about that. 200 individual attacks, 200 patterns dropped, dozens of convoys endangered while escorts chased a single submarine that heard every attack coming and maneuvered accordingly. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet, had worked out the mathematics of survival. His commanders knew that the first depth charge pattern was the most dangerous when the escort's position data was freshest. Survive that and your odds improved dramatically. The escort would lose sonar contact as its own propeller noise drowned out the hydrophones during the attack run. By the time the ship turned back to regain contact, you'd be elsewhere, deeper. Shallower, running a different course, and the pattern would start again. Cat and mouse in 3 dimensions, played in darkness, with death measured in proximity. British anti-submarine warfare specialists understood this perfectly. They needed something that removed the warning, something that didn't require passing over the target, something that gave the U-boat commander no time to react, no space to maneuver, no chance to be anywhere except where he already was when death arrived. They needed a weapon that attacked forward ahead of the ship before the submarine knew the attack had begun. Two men had been thinking about this problem longer than most. Lieutenant Commander Charles Anthony Clavering Howard joined the Royal Navy in 1903. By the First World War, he was a gunnery specialist aboard battleships. He understood trajectories, blast effects, the physics of throwing metal at high velocity toward targets that did not wish to be hit. Between the wars, while serving in various postings, he kept returning to a question that most naval officers considered already answered: how do you sink a submarine efficiently? His colleague, Commander Robert Oliver Hughes Hallett, brought a different expertise. Where Howard thought in terms of ballistics and blast radius, Hughes Hallett understood detection, sonar, hydrophones, the acoustic signatures that betrayed a submarine's position. Together, from different angles of the same problem, they converged on an idea. What if you didn't drop charges? What if you threw them forward, not artillery, not torpedoes, something in between? Small bombs launched ahead of the attacking ship, falling in a pattern that the submarine couldn't evade because it didn't know the attack was happening. Bombs that only exploded on contact with the submarine's hull, not at preset depths where they wasted their energy in empty water. The concept was radical enough that it required a name that sounded experimental, temporary, unthreatening. Hedgehog emerged from bureaucratic convenience. The device bristled with launcher spigots, 24 of them, arranged in 4 rows of 6 on a metal frame that someone thought resembled a hedgehog's spines. The name stuck because nobody expected the weapon to last long enough to need a proper designation. Development began in earnest in 1941 at HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's torpedo and mine school in Portsmouth. The Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a catch-all department for anything too strange to fit elsewhere, took ownership. Engineers designed the launcher, the projectiles, the firing sequence. They tested prototypes in controlled conditions. Then they mounted the first operational system aboard a destroyer and sent it to war. The Hedgehog launcher itself was deceptively simple. A steel cradle approximately 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, mounted on the foredeck ahead of the ship's main gun. 24 spigots angled forward and upward at a fixed elevation, arranged in an elliptical pattern. Each spigot would fire one projectile in rapid sequence. The entire salvo launched in less than a second, sending the bombs arcing forward through the air. The projectiles were equally straightforward. Each bomb weighed 65 pounds. A thin steel casing painted dark gray or black, roughly 7 inches in diameter, 30 inches long. The warhead contained 35 pounds of Torpex, one of the most powerful conventional explosives available. More importantly, the nose contained a contact fuse, not a depth-setting mechanism, not a timer, a simple mechanical trigger that armed itself during flight and detonated only when striking something solid. The physics were elegant. When fired, the salvo of 24 bombs flew forward in a ballistic arc, reaching approximately 250 yards ahead of the attacking ship. They struck the water in an elliptical pattern roughly 120 feet long and 140 feet wide, a footprint large enough to cover the probable error in the submarine's position, but small enough that every bomb remained potentially lethal. Once submerged, the bombs sank at a predictable rate, approximately 23 feet per second. If they struck a submarine's hull on the way down, the contact fuse detonated instantly. 35 pounds of Torpex at point-blank range could rupture pressure hull plating, collapse internal bulkheads, flood compartments faster than watertight doors could seal. 1 hit might cripple, 2 hits would likely kill. But if every bomb missed, if the U-boat was not where the attacking ship believed, then nothing exploded. The bombs simply sank to the ocean floor and lay inert, no wasteful detonations. No false kills that escort commanders might claim to satisfy impatient admirals. And crucially, no underwater explosions to destroy the attacking ship's sonar picture. This was the breakthrough that conventional depth charges could never achieve. When a depth charge detonated, even hundreds of feet away from both the escort and the U-boat, the explosion created a sonar blackout. Hydrophones went temporarily deaf, sound waves scattered in chaos. The escort lost contact, sometimes for minutes. The U-boat could maneuver during that blindness, and the hunt began again from scratch. Hedgehog changed the equation completely. Because the bombs only detonated on contact, a miss meant silence. The escort sonar operator maintained continuous contact. The U-boat commander, hearing no explosions, might believe he hadn't been attacked at all, might hold his course, might stay at depth, giving the escort time for a second salvo. And if the first pattern missed, the attacking ship could fire again within 2 minutes, and again, and again, each time refining the aim, each time tightening the pattern until the geometry allowed no escape. The first operational use occurred in late 1941. Results were inconclusive. Escort crews trained on depth charges found the new weapon strange. No explosion meant no feedback. You couldn't see if you were close. Couldn't adjust by watching where the water erupted. Just silence unless you hit. And hitting a moving submarine with an unguided ballistic weapon required skill that took time to develop. But by 1942, as Hedgehog installations spread through the escort fleet, the statistics began to shift. Depth charges, 5% kill rate per attack, 1 sinking for every 20 engagements, Hedgehog. 25% kill rate per attack, 1 sinking for every 4 engagements, 5 times more lethal. U-boat commanders began reporting something impossible. Survivors pulled from the Atlantic after their submarines sank described attacks that made no sense. Explosions without warning, no depth charges heard approaching, no churning propellers passing overhead, just sudden catastrophic detonations against the hull, multiple impacts within seconds, and then flooding, darkness, the terrible pressure of deep water crushing inward. Some thought they'd struck mines, though they were nowhere near known minefields. Others believed they'd been torpedoed by Allied submarines, though the geometry was wrong. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat headquarters in occupied France collected these reports and found no pattern that explained the losses. The truth remained classified. Britain did not advertise the Hedgehog's existence. Unlike radar, which the Germans knew about and developed themselves, the Hedgehog represented a tactical advantage that secrecy could preserve. German intelligence eventually identified the weapon from examination of captured ships and interrogation of prisoners, but by then, the U-boat fleet was already reeling. One engagement illustrates the weapon's effectiveness better than statistics. May 6, 1944, North Atlantic, south of Iceland, HMS Swale, a river-class frigate, detected a submarine contact while screening a convoy. The ASDIC operator, Royal Navy sonar, was called ASDIC then, an acronym lost to history, reported a solid return at 1,200 yards. The U-boat was submerged, heading southeast, depth estimated at 200 feet. Swale's captain ordered an attack approach. Standard procedure: close the range, maintain sonar contact, maneuver to firing position. No increase in speed, no dramatic dash over the target. The ship continued at 15 knots, a speed that kept propeller noise low enough that the sonar remained effective. The U-boat commander, if he heard anything, might have dismissed it as another merchant ship in the convoy, not an escort positioning for attack. At 300 yards, Swale fired a full Hedgehog salvo. 24 bombs arced forward through the gray Atlantic morning, struck the water in their elliptical pattern, and sank into the depths ahead of the frigate. Silence, 10 seconds. 15, then 3 underwater explosions in rapid succession. Witnesses on Swale's deck saw the water heave upward, massive columns of disturbed ocean, white and churning, erupting 200 yards ahead, 3 hits. Against a pressure hull already compromised by depth and age and months of patrol stress, 3 simultaneous 35-pound Torpex charges were catastrophic. The ASDIC return vanished. Oil began surfacing. Debris followed: wooden planking, clothing, a life vest stenciled with German lettering. HMS Swale circled the area for 30 minutes, but nothing else emerged. No survivors, no further contact. The U-boat, later identified through Enigma decrypts as U-765, had gone from operational to destroyed in under a minute. The entire engagement, from first detection to confirmed kill, lasted less than 8 minutes. No depth charge attack could have achieved that efficiency. The U-boat would have heard the escort accelerating, would have maneuvered, would have forced multiple attack runs, each one giving it more time to escape or summon help from other U-boats prowling nearby. But Hedgehog gave it no time, no warning, no chance. Why did this invisible weapon succeed where depth charges struggled? The answer lies in 3 principles that British anti-submarine specialists had to learn through bitter experience. First, silence preserves contact. Sonar in the 1940s was primitive by modern standards. Sound waves traveled through water at varying speeds depending on temperature, salinity, pressure. Layers of different temperature water bent sonar beams, created false echoes, hid submarines in acoustic shadows. An escort ship's sonar operator needed continuous, uninterrupted contact to build an accurate picture of where the submarine actually was versus where its echoes suggested it might be. Every depth charge explosion destroyed that picture. The shockwave scattered sound in all directions. The bubble of gases released by the detonation created an acoustic mirror that reflected sonar pulses. For crucial minutes after a depth charge attack, the escort was effectively blind. By the time sonar cleared, the submarine had moved, and the hunt began again with degraded position data. Hedgehog only exploded on contact on success. A miss left the water acoustically undisturbed. The sonar operator maintained his lock. The captain could fire a second salvo with updated targeting, then a third, refining the aim with each attempt until the pattern converged on the evading submarine. Persistence without blindness. Second, forward-throwing geometry eliminates warning. Depth charges required the attacking ship to pass over the target. The submarine heard the escort approaching, propellers growing louder, bearing steady, speed increasing. An experienced commander knew exactly what that meant. He had time, not much, but enough to attempt evasion. Emergency dive, hard rudder, silent running to minimize his acoustic signature. Anything to be elsewhere when the charges detonated. Hedgehog fired from 300 yards ahead of the ship. The submarine's hydrophone operator might hear distant propellers, but they weren't approaching directly, weren't accelerating, weren't displaying the acoustic signature of an imminent attack. And then, with no transition, no warning, the bombs were falling through the water toward him. By the time he understood what was happening, if he understood at all, the elliptical pattern was already descending through his depth, and there was nowhere to go that wasn't inside the kill zone. Third, contact fusing ensured lethality. Depth charges detonated at preset depths, 150 feet, 300 feet, whatever the attacking crew selected based on their best estimate of the U-boat's position. But submarine commanders knew this. They could go deeper than expected, forcing the charges to explode uselessly overhead, or shallower, letting the blasts waste their energy in water that was now empty. The vertical dimension became an escape route. Hedgehog removed that option. The bombs armed themselves during flight, then detonated only when striking something solid. If the U-boat was at 150 feet, the bombs found it there. If it had gone to 300 feet, the bombs sank until they struck hull at 300 feet. Depth became irrelevant. The submarine could dive, but it couldn't dive away from a weapon that followed it down until making contact or reaching the seabed. Against German countermeasures, Hedgehog proved remarkably resistant. U-boats deployed Pillenwerfer, chemical canisters that released clouds of bubbles to create false sonar targets. Effective against depth charges, because escorts would waste patterns attacking phantom contacts. Less effective against Hedgehog, because a miss produced no explosion. The escort crew knew immediately that they'd targeted a decoy and could ignore it and continue hunting the real submarine. U-boats tried running silent at deep depth, minimizing noise to disappear from sonar. Effective for short periods but unsustainable. Batteries drained, air went foul. Eventually, the submarine had to move to run ventilation to make noise, and the patient escort would be there, waiting, with Hedgehog salvos ready. U-boats attempted to hide in thermal layers where temperature gradients bent sonar beams. This worked sometimes, but Hedgehog's elliptical pattern was large enough that positioning errors were less critical than with depth charges. Close was good enough, and the ability to fire multiple salvos without losing contact meant the escort could walk its fire through the search area systematically. The Americans noticed. By 1943, U.S. Navy escort carriers and destroyer escorts were entering service in large numbers, joining the Battle of the Atlantic. American depth charge doctrine mirrored British practice, same tactics, same frustrations, same disappointing kill rates. When U.S. Navy observers saw Hedgehog results, they requested immediate adoption. Production began in the United States under license. American shipyards installed Hedgehog systems on destroyer escorts, patrol frigates, even some larger Coast Guard cutters assigned to convoy duty. The weapon crossed the Atlantic in reverse, British innovation arming American escorts that would hunt U-boats in waters where German submarines had once operated with near impunity. The U.S. Navy also developed Mousetrap, a simplified version with 8 spigots instead of 24, intended for smaller vessels. Mousetrap used the same contact-fused bombs, the same forward-throwing principle, but with a reduced salvo size that fit on ships too small for the full Hedgehog mounting. The name came from the obvious metaphor, an invisible trap that gave the prey no warning until it sprang shut. Meanwhile, British engineers continued refining the concept. Squid emerged in 1943 as Hedgehog's larger, more sophisticated successor. Instead of 24 small bombs, Squid fired 3 large depth charges, each containing 390 pounds of explosive, in a triangular pattern ahead of the ship. Unlike Hedgehog's contact fuses, Squid used timer fuses preset by an electromechanical computer that calculated the target's depth from sonar data. The charges detonated simultaneously at the correct depth, creating a shockwave pattern that was almost impossible to survive if the submarine was anywhere inside the triangle. Squid was more lethal than Hedgehog, 50% kill rate per attack, but also more complex, more expensive, and arrived later in the war. Hedgehog had already equipped hundreds of escorts by the time Squid reached operational status, and many ships retained Hedgehog through war's end simply because it worked well enough and was already installed. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively. U-boat losses exceeded replacement rates. Dernitz's crews, once confident hunters, now faced an ocean where every convoy bristled with escorts equipped with radar, sonar, and forward-throwing weapons that killed without warning. The happy time, the period in 1940-41, when U-boats sank ships faster than the Allies could build them, had ended. Now submarines were dying faster than Germany could train new crews. May 1943 marked the strategic turning point. 41 U-boats sank that month, more than Germany could replace. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic, conceding defeat in the campaign that was supposed to strangle Britain into surrender. Hedgehog contributed materially to that defeat. Not alone, aircraft, radar, code breaking, and sheer weight of numbers all played their parts. But in the intimate violence of escort versus submarine combat, Hedgehog gave Allied ships a weapon that removed the U-boat's greatest advantage: the ability to hear death approaching and maneuver away. The statistics compiled after the war tell the story cleanly. From 1939 to 1945, the Royal Navy sank approximately 500 German U-boats through direct action. Of those, depth charges accounted for the majority, simply because most escorts carried only depth charges for most of the war. But measured by efficiency, by percentage of attacks that resulted in kills, Hedgehog outperformed depth charges by a factor of 5. Put another way, if every Allied escort had been equipped with Hedgehog from 1941 onward, instead of relying primarily on depth charges, the Battle of the Atlantic might have ended a year earlier. Thousands of merchant sailors might have survived, hundreds of cargo ships might have reached port. The calculation is speculative, but the trend is clear. Hedgehog killed submarines at a rate that depth charges never matched. And the German submariners never solved it, couldn't develop countermeasures against a weapon that gave no tactical warning, couldn't evade a pattern that covered their probable position and followed them to whatever depth they chose. Couldn't even hear the attack coming because it arrived ahead of the escort ship's acoustic signature, silent until detonation. The weapon that made no sound had done exactly what British anti-submarine specialists needed. It gave U-boats no time to react, no space to maneuver, and no warning that death was seconds away. After the war, Hedgehog vanished from active service with surprising speed. By the 1950s, Cold War anti-submarine warfare had evolved beyond Second World War technology. Guided torpedoes, rocket-delivered depth charges, nuclear-powered submarines that operated at speeds and depths that made 1940s weapons obsolete. These replaced the forward-throwing mortars that had served so well against Germany's U-boats. Squid survived longer than Hedgehog, remaining in Royal Navy service into the 1970s on some frigates and patrol vessels. But even Squid eventually gave way to modern systems like Akara, ASROC, and ultimately helicopter-delivered torpedoes that could hunt submarines at ranges measured in miles rather than yards. Hedgehog systems were dismantled from decommissioned escorts. Some went to museums. The Imperial War Museum in London displays a complete launcher, the spigot still angled forward, the mechanism still ready to throw bombs that will never be fired. Naval history societies in Britain, Canada, and the United States preserve examples as artifacts of the Battle of the Atlantic, when the outcome of the war depended on whether merchant ships could cross 3,000 miles of submarine-infested ocean and survive. The weapon's legacy persists in modern doctrine. Every navy that hunts submarines understands the principles that made Hedgehog effective: maintain sonar contact continuously, attack before the target knows it's threatened, use weapons that only explode on success so tactical picture remains clear. Those concepts, proven in the freezing Atlantic against Germany's U-boats, remain foundational to anti-submarine warfare even in an age of satellite tracking and autonomous underwater drones. 7 feet of steel frame. 24 spigots, contact-fused bombs that exploded only when striking a hull. Perhaps 1,000 Hedgehog systems were installed across Allied escort fleets. Perhaps more. Production records for wartime equipment are incomplete. Dozens of U-boats went to the bottom from Hedgehog attacks, their crews never understanding what had killed them, never hearing the weapon's approach, never given the chance to evade. The McLaglen Pesquet, that other British weapon of silent killing, combined three methods into one ingenious device and never confirmed a single operational kill. Hedgehog, simpler and more specialized, sank submarines by the dozen. Sometimes the best weapon is not the one that does everything, but the one that does exactly what's needed, without compromise, without warning, without giving the enemy time to realize the attack has already begun. That innocent-looking frame mounted on a destroyer's foredeck, bristling with spigots that angled forward into the gray Atlantic morning. It may have looked like industrial plumbing, like something that belonged in a factory rather than a warship. But to the German submariners who never heard it coming, who never had time to dive or turn or run, it was death arriving in silence. And that silence, in the end, was worth more than thunder. Silence, in the end, was worth more than thunder.